Hey folks, hope you guys are having a great day. I got my world building hat on because we're going to talk a little bit about world building. So what is world building? I feel like I always have to do at least a video on this every once in a while or address it in a stream. And like how you go about it and how do you do a good job world building, because I've written some fantasy novels in a shared universe, I guess is what you might say about it. And so, you know, I've learned some important things, I guess, along the way, and I've observed some interesting trends over not just the last couple years, really like the last 20 years is what I'd say, where there's been an influence on how authors approach the setting because of basically because of role-playing games, like Dungeons and Dragons is probably the most popular one. Like that's the big brand, and it has been really for a while. But there's others. There's plenty of others, right? You know, like Cyberpunk 2077 is a video game that's based on a tabletop RPG. And if you're playing Baldur's Gate, any of the Baldur's Gate games, that is a video game based on a tabletop RPG, and it has a bunch of rule sets. Now, the rules tends to be what people kind of think of and focus on when they are thinking of like how to design a setting that they're going to set a science fiction or a fantasy kind of story in. World building is not something you have to do a whole lot of outside of certain genres of fiction. So I guess before I dive into it, let me talk about what genres you probably need to do world building in. So you're probably not going to need to do world building in contemporary literary fiction. It takes place in our world. You don't need to talk about it a whole lot. If you're doing something like magical realism, which is probably more popular, I think, with Spanish language books, you have to talk about like the rule set of what you're doing. If you are doing historical fiction, you may need to do some world building because the past is like a foreign country. And because the past is like a foreign country, you need to kind of explain to the reader or the viewer, or whatever medium you happen to be in, how that world works, how that foreign country operates, what its culture is like, all that kind of stuff. And so you do have to do some world building for historical fiction. Namely, you shouldn't assume that a reader is intimately familiar with your setting when the setting is not modern day. That's the gist of it, right? So I write a novel set in feudal Japan. I need to be able to expose a little bit about how feudal Japan works, how the people think, how the people dress, how the people act, what rituals they observe, things like that. All of that goes into the world building of a book like Muramasa Blood Drinker, right? And I call that kind of historical fantasy because it's just it's historical fiction, but we're not looking at, it doesn't fit in with most historical fiction novels where it's like, what if this were different? Or like, I'm going to write a book about, Caligula's wife or something, and it's going to be about how she was scheming and killing people. It's like, that's not what that's about. Muramasa Blood Drinker is a thriller and a mystery novel. It's really not a standard historical fiction novel at all, which is another reason why, it wasn't ever really going to get traditionally published, is that it is just it's too weird. It's too outside the norm for what people would want, especially for like a first published book. Anyway, so you do have to do it for that. But the main ones that people focus on are science fiction and fantasy. Science fiction being a subgenre of fantasy. So before I go further, let me make this point. This will ruffle feathers, but for the purposes of this discussion and for understanding how things are constructed technically, science fiction is a subgenre of fantasy. Okay, what's the difference between science fiction and fantasy? Some tropes with the setting is mostly what it is, right? Whereas a full like high fantasy setting would have magic, science fiction, you see, has technology. Well, does the technology exist? No, the technology is made up. I'm like, okay, so it is magic. So yes, the science fiction book is a fantasy book, but it just is in a different sort of trope area with some different expectations for how readers, what kind of story readers want, and how the magic is presented, right? The magic is presented as technology. We have a warp field around our starship that allows us to travel faster than light. It's like, how does that work? We warp space. How? Like, this technology doesn't exist. It's made up. It's magic. And so that's a thing that a lot of people just don't. I can see my kids playing in the camera. I'm trying to get a camera angle that doesn't have so many kids. I could do it like this. There you go. Now you can see like my messy workstation over there. All right, so yes. It's all magic, right? When you get that technology functions as magic, it's easy to understand that science fiction, for the purposes of this discussion, is a subgenre of fantasy. Fantasy being fantastical fiction, fiction that contains elements that are non-real. So world building is about exposing and making coherent the non-real aspects of your setting. When I talked about settings, I divided fantasy into a couple of different areas. There was high fantasy and low fantasy. These are technical definitions, not genre definitions. People often misunderstand this, right? So high fantasy is like, it's a different world that's not our world. In which case, your geography, you have to figure out what the geography is, the cultures, the people. You have to figure out the languages that they might speak. You have to figure out the cultural attitudes, the weapons they might use, the technology they might have. All of that has to be, like, the world building has to be more thorough. For low fantasy, you're just sort of adding to the real world magical elements, like Harry Dresden. So the Dresden Files are an example of a low fantasy setting. There's tons of fantasy elements, but those fantasy elements are kind of pasted onto a world that we're familiar with, and whose, I'm going to use the word rule set a lot because it makes sense for the purposes of this discussion. However, my caution is to not have you think of, I would prefer for authors to not think of the elements of their world as being rule sets like an RPG. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But so everything functions normally, except for we also have magic, and the magic might have, some different functions. And then the whole purpose of changing the elements of the setting, changing things to be not real, is that it changes what's possible with the story. It changes the kind of story you can tell. So if you have a story that is about, for instance, knights, right? Knights have certain attitudes, they have certain technology. So they can't do the same thing that a 20th century detective could do, right? They can't shoot their revolver at their enemy, right? They have to, they have to stick to what's possible for them. So it's really about changing the dynamics of the story, changing what's possible. Same thing with science fiction. We add some technology in. We have clones or something, right? How would the world be different if there were clones? There's a speculative question usually with most science fiction when it comes to adding elements of the story. So there's a speculative idea there. What would the world be like if we had a bunch of clones running around, if we had androids, right? Would androids, if we invaded them, dream of electric sheep, right? What is an android? It's like a Philip K. Dick sort of question. And that's a certain current of science fiction. It's not a current of science fiction you're going to find, excuse me, if you go really far back. If you go really far back, science fiction's really adventure stories with, a non-medieval kind of setting, right? Like a technological setting, a future setting where there's ray guns and stuff like that. They're always adventure stories. They're not like introspective, what is humanity stories. That's something that kind of picks up in the mid-century with some other kind of influencers like the magazines. So anyway, know kind of what area you're going to be in for world building. And one of the problems that I've noticed with world building is, and this is with fantasy in general, fantasy has become influenced by role-playing games. It's not bad. I like role-playing games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons type stuff, 2nd edition onwards. If you go back and you look at AD&D, you guys, maybe you know Jeffrey Johnson and you know like How to Win at D&D or the Appendix N book. If you go back to original D&D, like D&D 1.0 or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, there's no like story scenarios really, like in the original game. That kind of came later, where it's like there's a pre-built story where there's pre-built characters and you kind of play through a story. This is why when someone's like, oh, D&D is a collaborative storytelling, I'm like, nope, it's a game with rules, and you play the game according to the rules with the object being to win the game because it's a game, not collaborative storytelling. If you want to do collaborative storytelling, get your Legos out and have some pretend play, like build Legos, right? I get to do, maybe it's like, I might be slightly cynical on this because I have children. And so like a good portion of my day involves pretend play. So because a good portion of my day involves pretend play, I tend to not want that out of a tabletop game. I want a game that has a challenge, that has something to beat, right? So later D&D, we have this idea of a story coming into play and people wanting to play a game that's in the context of some kind of fantasy story, which is in turn influenced by fantasy fiction that came beforehand. But we get this interesting crossover that happens, in the 1990s, maybe really the 1980s. Probably like the Dragonlance books are like maybe patient zero of this, but it's not severe with the Tracy Hickman books, right? And Margaret Weiss, right? It's not severe for their books where they are writing rules. They're writing an RPG and there's like some characters that are in it, right? They're writing stories. Any kind of rules of D&D are like way in the background, more drawn out of the influences of what they're doing, but it's there, right? By the time we get to something like Robert Jordan, or Robert Jordan's probably the best example I can think of. So Robert Jordan has a very codified magic system. This is very different from something like Jack Vance, where there's magic, but the rules are pretty loose. Like, you can discover any kind of magic would be possible in a Jack Vance book. But in Robert Jordan, we have this idea of like the one power and these different spells that you can do and like different rules that apply to it. And then you end up with a newer crop of fantasy writers like Brandon Sanderson and Steven Erikson, who did the Malazan books. And a lot of people like Brandon Sanderson for his setting details. That is, his world building is really good. And you can find in a lot of Brandon Sanderson books, and I'm thinking really, the two that really stand out to me are like the Mistborn books. Probably those more than anything, but also like Way of Kings, the Stormlight Archive. These ones have really advanced world building, and they have rule sets like an RPG almost, right? So there's like allomancy, and here's all the rules of allomancy, and here's how you use it, and here's its limitations. And Brandon Sanderson's really excellent at using those to create a solution to the conflict of the story, at least in that first Mistborn book. And it's really clever, and it works really well. And he does similar things in the Stormlight Archive. He just kind of takes longer to do them. So the tendency is for people to not think of the plot that comes out of this carefully constructed set of rules, but rather to think of the rules themselves as something that they need to focus on. And that's the big mistake with world building. And so that's my big caution before I start digging into like lots of other stuff is world building exists to facilitate a story and to make the story more coherent, more realistic, and more fun for the reader. World building does not exist per se. It does not exist on its own according to its own life, right? It's not a living thing that you need to focus on for its own sake, right? It exists to serve a story. And this is as true as with Tolkien as it is with Brandon Sanderson, right? Just Brandon Sanderson likes to have magical rule sets, thus turning them more into a science fiction-y setting by having rules to the magic. Allomancy makes me think more of like typical science fiction than it does of most fantasy. Nothing wrong with that. Right, nothing wrong with that. So when you are world building, what you want to think about is what story is going to exist in that world. A lot of times people do this backwards. I've met so many fantasy authors either here or on the internet or in real life, and what they tend to do is they're like, I've spent 10 years developing my setting. I'm like, wow. And how many how many books have you written in it? Well, I haven't written any books in it yet. I'm like, okay, so are you developing an RPG? No. Okay, well, maybe it sounds like you've been developing an RPG. This is for writing books and stuff. Well, I know you could put an RPG in it. Yeah, you could. Sounds like you've thought of a lot of stuff, right? And it actually, I'm just reminded of something like Twilight Force, right? This power metal band I like. They're very theatrical, very fun. If you like D&D kind of stuff, it's like, oh, we have this. Here's this thing. It's like I don't know. They have like a wiki on the little universe that they invented for their music. And I'm like, that's cool. But when I look at that, I'm like, you should just write a book in it. There was a band called Fellowship that I've talked about on the channel before. They did this. They like wrote a tie-in novel to their album, which is really cool. And I think more bands should attempt that. And it's okay if they're not novelists. They could hire a Twilight Force superfan to write their book in their little universe to make it real, right? So a universe isn't real until people are in it, till there's characters doing things in it, and there's a conflict that needs to be resolved. Otherwise, it's just, it's not even a history book, right? Because when we're reading a history book, we're reading about things that happened. So you need things that happen in your world for it to really live and breathe. And so to that end, I think whatever you do for establishing your world, it is for the benefit of the story, and we should, as authors, avoid doing it absent that, right? So let's think of some examples. I already mentioned The Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. That first Mistborn, like Final Empire. I don't want to give you too many spoilers because I think it's at least book one, I think, is good. Brandon Sanderson writes really good book ones. Anyway, book one, we have allomancy. We have a magical system that has rules to it. The rules of that system end up producing a block where we can't figure out how to defeat the Lord Ruler. We discover something about the Lord Ruler that lets us apply the rules that we've learned in the characters, right? What's her name? The main character. She applies the rules she's learned about allomancy to this situation and comes up with the solution, the way to beat the Lord Ruler. And there's more to it than that. There's the what are they called? The Inquisitors. They have like spikes through their eyes and all kinds of stuff, right? There's all these other things that go along with that rule set, but the main thing is that we have a setting that includes the rule set, and that produces a solution. Now, there's more to the setting than that rule set, right? There's like at nighttime, there's weird monsters that come out. There's like ash falling from the sky all the time. Everybody lives in these cities. There's this upper class and this lower class, the ska or whatever. Right? All of that plays into it to create and channel the actions of the characters towards a conflict and towards a conclusion. That it also gives them motivation, right? You have a character who's been imprisoned in these mines, and of course has a chip on his shoulder about that. Anybody who's lived as like part of the lower caste wants to change the social order. There's motivations galore in that setting for the characters. So a setting, your characters live in the setting, which means they're going to be motivated by the things which matter in that setting, and not by the things that are absent that setting. This is important for historical fiction, because if you're setting something in feudal Japan, you're not going to have a character be a libertarian. That whole line of thinking would just be completely alien to them. They're going to think similarly, even if they're like an oddball and think differently from everyone else. They're going to think similarly to other people from the same time and place as themselves, right? So they're going to exist in the Japanese culture. Likewise, you make up a new culture, the people are going to exist in that culture, and they're going to have behaviors and attitudes that adhere to that. They're going to act in ways that restrict or enable the characters to do certain actions. So all of those things go into the setting. The setting will also present challenges and obstacles for the protagonist to resolve the conflict. The conflict should arise from the setting. The conflict should be part of the setting in any sort of fantasy work, right? Like we have to destroy the Ring of Power. Okay, that's like arising from the setting, a magical artifact that has to get destroyed. So if you think, if we just use Tolkien as an example, right? Bilbo has to go from his hobbit hole to the Lonely Mountain, has to go to Erebor. What stops him? There's a bunch of things, right? Okay, we have to travel through the wilderness. There's trolls there. So the fact that there's trolls that exist in this world, they are a hazard to the hero. The hero has to overcome that obstacle. Okay, makes sense. The trolls are serving the purpose of the story. And we're also learned that trolls turn to stone when the sun comes up, which is an interesting little kind of fairy tale tidbit, but it works, and it provides a solution for how do they get away from the trolls. Well, Gandalf just delays them to the point where the sun comes up and turns into stone. That's a very fairy tale kind of conclusion, slightly unexpected conclusion to things. What's the next thing? Oh, well, they have the Misty Mountains. Goblins attack them. So there's goblins in the world. Obviously, goblins hate dwarves. There's some history there. There's been wars between goblins and dwarves with the mines of Moria. That's all in The Hobbit. Keep going. There's talking wolves. The wolves want to eat them. Obviously, the wolves are a hazard. Now we're starting to get a broader conflicts coming out of the setting. There's goblins. They hate men and dwarves. There's wolves. They hate men. There's this Bjorn guy who lives outside of society. We got to go through this ancient forest. There's talking spiders inside the ancient forest that are, what are they, they're the spiders really exist to create hazards for the heroes to overcome. Are the spiders like inseparable from Tolkien's legendarium? Not even really. There's, Ungoliant and ancient spiders in like the Silmarillion, but the truth is the spiders are there to be an obstacle to Bilbo and Thorin and company. The elves are there. The nature of the elves determines how they treat the dwarves. They're nice to them, but they don't let them go. They live underground. That's how they get the escape. It provides a solution with like the barrels. How the dragons act has to do with creating obstacles and opportunities for Bilbo and a way for Bard to kill the dragon. So everything that exists in The Hobbit that's part of the setting, dragons and dwarves, all this stuff exists kind of above the story, but enables the relationships in the story to exist and enables for a lot of the actions of the heroes to happen. So good world building will enable the story. It will not, it will not be opposed to it. The big mistake a lot of rookie writers make is they start writing RPG rule books in the middle of their novel. They're like, okay, I need to describe all these important things about the setting that I've thought so much about. I've done all this world building, and I have to communicate it. That's like, hold up. Before you start thinking about every little aspect of the magic of your world, you have to think about what the conflict is and who the characters are. That's how you lead a story. So when you begin the story, you don't begin with the setting. Right? You begin with a character. You begin with a character, and the character has to solve a problem. That's the way that you really lead in with the story. So before we get all the details of how the world works, in The Hobbit, for instance, we meet Bilbo and we meet Gandalf, and then we meet dwarves. And they have an adventure. They have a conflict. They have a problem that needs to be solved. We got to get our treasure back from Smaug the dragon. So all that stuff works really well. Let's talk about some of the elements of story crafting elements when it comes to creating a setting or world building. So let's start with number one is geography. So this doesn't apply to low fantasy as much to high fantasy, right? Low fantasy, it's our world. So we don't really need to deal with geography. High fantasy, you need to deal with the geography of how things work. Now, there's two paths that authors go. They go completely the fantastical direction like Michael Moorcock, which is like there's boiling seas and, crazy crap. You could do that, or you can go the more realistic route. If you go the more realistic route, it's good to have a basic understanding of not just, most of them when you study geography, you're like, this country's over there, but how terrain works. How does terrain work, and how do climates work? And why do different places have different climates and different terrain from other places? So let's look at California as an example. I'll pull up a map of California, right? California is great because California is like a little tiny, it's a big state, but it has a huge variety of geography in a small place, all due to the terrain that exists there. It has the biggest trees in the world, the tallest trees in the world. It's got the tallest mountains in the 48 United States. It has the deepest place in the 48 states of the United States, the lower 48. It has deserts. It has riparian habitats, forests, valleys, lakes, rivers. It's got everything in it. All of them are a function of the geography of the state. So we'll just look at a map of California because it'll show it to us. Let me see if I can, how can I set this up? We're going to look at a real place because this is like a little science lesson, but it will show you what's important, okay? Let me see here. Oh, there we go. All right. Let me make this a little bigger. We'll just look at Google Maps because that works really good. Okay. All right. Boop, boop, boop. Google Maps of California. Okay. So look at those wonderful cliffs. So California has some desert regions and it has some greenish regions, although these are actually pretty dry. They're plains. It has mountains and it has forests. It has bays, estuaries, rivers, everything. So if you look, there's two mountain ranges in California. The first one we call the coastal mountains, or these go up into what we call the Cascades. And then these are the Sierra Nevada mountains. If you look at the Sierra Nevadas, you notice they're green on one side and brown on the other. So what is that about? Well, this is what's called a rain shadow. You get deserts on the far side of mountains from the ocean. So the ocean, the clouds are made in the ocean. The sun heats the water evaporates, it makes clouds, the clouds blow over the land. They drop rain according to the topography of the land. So in order to climb over these mountains, they have to get smaller and they precipitate. The temperature appears lower, it causes precipitation. So as the clouds blow over the Sierra Nevadas, they precipitate and they basically lose their ability in this low spot to drop a lot of moisture until you get way over here where it's higher. back over in like Utah and Colorado and stuff, right? So Nevada's very dry. It's a big dry area. Same thing with down here. You have a very small range of mountains and then a desert. And this has to do with the way that the ocean currents go. They go down from Alaska and around this way. Okay, so the ocean currents go down here. The clouds blow this way, and by the time they get over here, they've crossed over these mountains, maybe these mountains. They crossed over the Grapevine, which is south of Bakersfield, and they're done. Like, they've lost all their moisture. Okay, hopefully this stuff hopefully this stuff makes sense. Okay, in the middle here is what we call the Central Valley. Sometimes it's broken up into two valleys: the Sacramento Valley, which is the northern half, the San Joaquin Valley, which is the southern half. Okay, this is also in a rain shadow, but we get more rain in the Central Valley than we do in Nevada. I've also lived in Nevada, right? And we get more rain there because the Cascades are lower than the Sierras. So they're high enough that as clouds pass over, they rain. We get lots of rain in the Central Coast, not a lot of rain in the Central Valley, and then a lot of rain in the Sierras, and a lot of snow, actually, because they're very tall, and then not a lot of rain. So if you were to travel from San Francisco, we travel across a vast plain, even though it doesn't look that vast on the satellite. This is a vast plain over here, okay? We travel across big bridges and a big city. This is all rural. Nobody really lives out here. And then you climb up over the mountains. This is Lake Tahoe up here by Reno. And so you go across the plains, then you're going through forests, seeing the tallest trees in the world. Then you go up to a lake at the top of the mountains, and it's snowing. It's snowing all across the top of the mountains. You got to get through the snow. Then on the other side, it's a cold desert, right? So think about when you are designing your maps, the maps should function somewhat like the real world does as far as mountain ranges and deserts go. Do you have a desert that's near an ocean? Technically, yes. But look at the distance here. There's 50 or 100 miles between the Mojave and like the actual ocean, because there's going to be rain that drops down here by the ocean, or in the Imperial Valley and places like that. Why is the Central Valley so green if it doesn't get a lot of rain? The answer is because there's rain here. It runs down the rivers into the Central Valley, and we irrigate all the crops that way. This is all ag here. All that green is man-made green. If there was no one living there, it would be brown. See, the edges are brown? The edges are brown because this is where people do not live and farm. We call these the foothills. The foothills are not good for farming for the most part. You just kind of graze cattle on them. And it's rich enough to like have your cattle kind of wander around and eat, get fat, take them to market when they're ready. And then down here in this flat part, that's where you grow all the crops, where you grow all the almonds and the oranges and the wheat and whatever else you're growing. You don't get snow here. You get snow here. You get a little bit of snow here, very rarely. You get lots and lots of snow on the tall mountains. So as the clouds pass over the tall mountains, they drop the snow. The snow melts, turns into the runoff of the rivers, and feeds the valleys. We kind of have it all here. If we get closer in here, like if we get down to like, Morro Bay or San Luis Obispo, there's swamps and stuff down here, salt marshes. There's all kinds of stuff, okay? As you get closer, you see this is all this green is man-made. It's all man-made green. And the brown is the areas where there's like no one doing anything. We just graze cattle out there. That's pretty much how it works, right? So anyway, look at that as an example of real world. I mean, you can do this with anywhere in the world, but California is great because it has this valley and you get an idea. What happens on this big scale can happen on small scales, right? If we're over here somewhere in Texas, you see it's green on one side. These are forests. Over here, it's desert. These are big mountainous areas, but they're still desert because they're so far inland, right? Same thing with like, go look at the Sahara or something like that. Okay. So anyway, that gives you an idea. If you're going to start with geography, the geography should function, well, like I said, if you're going to go with the realistic way, geography functions according to the things that I just talked about. If you're going unrealistic, we're like, okay, now there's a boiling sea over here, and there's a, something else in a different area that affects this. Like in Way of Kings, there's storms. There's these big storms, and they start on one side of the map and they move across to the other. And so he starts with that as a like the main constraint of the geography is like, okay, there's these storms that like destroy everything, and they start on this side and they move to the other side. So the plants are really hardy. They have to withstand the storms, including grass that like shrinks down under the earth. Okay. And we don't have a lot of mammals because mammals are not very tough. So we have bugs. We have like, giant bugs and bugs that we call hounds. They call them like Nick's hounds or something, but they're bugs, right? So we have bugs. So that's kind of cool, and right. But ultimately, like, we're replacing dogs with bugs. It's not that important that we think like super detailed. It's just like a different little detail. But the main thing is the storms are like that. Then you get over to the far side of the map and you get these people that have big eyes. I always took that to mean that they looked kind of like Europeans, right? So on one side of the map, they look more Asian in the east side. And on the other side, they look more European with their big open eyes. So you start with one idea of geography, one thing that disturbs our normal geography, and then you kind of carry that through so that it's all coherent. I have been critical in the past, so I'll while I'm thinking of Wayne Key, so we're thinking of geography. I'll give you the critical thing that I've talked about in the past with like monetary systems. So we have geography. Geography impacts, of course, what you can do in an area. So if you have a desert, people in the desert have a different culture than people in the forest. Why is that? Well, they have a different set of circumstances and dangers that they have to overcome. In the desert, you're not likely to get eaten by too many things. Like we have mountain lions that are kind of in the desert area, but if you're out in the Mojave, there's not really anything out there that's going to eat you. Like wolves don't live there, right? Coyotes, maybe, but coyotes are not that dangerous, right? There's not a lot that's going to eat you. If you're in the forest, there's bears and wolves and grizzly bears, like black bears, grizzly bears, wolves, and all of them want to eat you. Right? So the richer environment has bigger predators that are a natural danger. But the forest is pretty rich. You can hunt deer. There's lots of things to eat in the forest. Whereas in the desert, not a lot of things want to eat you, but there's not a lot of things to eat. So you have to figure out how to master that environment to allow yourself to eat. How do you do irrigate? Irrigation is critical in a desert kind of area. In a mountainous area, people that live in the jungle don't need to irrigate anything. They're like, what do you mean? Irrigate. I walk to the tree and I pick the fruit off and eat it, right? The environment is so rich. The danger is I get diseases and die, or gorilla comes around and kills me, or the lion comes and eats me, right? So, yeah, it's like, why didn't sub-Saharan Africans invent all of this irrigation? It's like they really didn't have to. They lived in a really rich environment where they could subsist off like basic horticulture and hunter-gathering societies and live that way. Whereas if you live in the frozen north, it's like you have this cycle of seasons where we got to grow food during this time when the sun is out, and we have to save it for the winter, which means we have to pick certain crops. We can't just grow cherries or strawberries, right? We can't just go pick wild strawberries. We'll starve in the winter. We have to have agriculture or animal agriculture. We have to have something to eat in the winter. Changes the society tremendously. If you live in the mountains, it's a rougher terrain, so you're probably end up with a different culture that way, right? Somebody who lives in the frozen north of Norway, the fjords, with harsh winters and long days in the summer. How does that affect their culture? Think of like real world cultures as a way to start when you're thinking about fictional cultures. Think of Finland, right? So Finland has a sauna culture. This was a controversy when a metal musician named Jari Minpa crowdfunded a studio, and like the plans for the studio included a sauna. People were like, in America, houses don't usually come with saunas, right? I've never seen a house with a sauna. I don't think I've ever been in a house with a sauna in the United States. And I make this point. Someone who's in Finland wouldn't understand why we don't have saunas in Houston. It's like the sauna is called walking outside, bro. It's 90 degrees with 80% humidity. It's a sauna outside. The feeling of the sauna in the winter in Finland is just a normal day in Houston, Texas, right? That's just how it is. Why would I need a sauna? It's already hot. Okay. And during the winter, yeah, maybe a sauna would be nice, but mostly it's like we actually had, it had snow. We snowed here, not yesterday, maybe it was yesterday. What is it? Wednesday? Maybe Monday. It snowed. It's so rare, and it snowed. It's like, oh, it snowed, and then it melted. It's like gone, right? Snow is so rare here that it's almost not worth mentioning. It's like there's 10 days a year where you'd want a sauna. It's like, oh, most of it's like hot, moist. You just go take a hot shower, like you have a hot water heater, right? But in Finland, there's a sauna culture. Where does the sauna culture come from? Well, it's cold in Finland, right? They have a long winter, and it's pretty harsh. So having that contrast, you develop a culture around the contrast of coming out of the cold and being in a communal space where everybody can get hot and warm their bodies up and get the health benefits of heat and moisture in a place where it's so cold that the moisture just gets sucked out of the air. Like you look out and you're like, oh, it's covered in snow. It's got to be like moist there. Nope. It gets dry as a bone because once it gets really cold, that moisture just kind of falls out of the air. It like accumulates as frost. They call it hoarfrost, right? It gets dry. That's what like the Antarctic desert. How is Antarctica a desert when it's covered in snow? It's like there's no precipitation. That's why. So yeah, so think about that. So like a sauna culture might exist, or a longhouse culture, something where people enjoy heat in a place where it's cold. If you have a place that's really hot, what do people like to do? Well, they probably like cold things. They like to swim. So the people that live in the hot environment, they're going to be swimming all the time. So where you put the people changes their culture. And it changes the way that they organize their societies and things like that. So geography has a huge impact on everything, right? After you get past geography, then you can start to think about all the other peculiarities that go into culture. What are their gods like? What's their religion like? How does their religion affect their culture, and how does it serve their culture? This is something that I think a lot of modern post-Protestant atheist types miss about religion is they come into it with an assumption of it being like false on some level, and so they can't really write a convincing religion because they can't really think of how the religion serves the people. They think of it as like inhibiting the people or being bad for the people. But if you read, for instance, Roman history, you don't get a sense of that. You get a sense of the gods like being involved in the state and actively doing things, and there's omens. There was a Caracalla. I'm trying to remember the name of the there was a Praetorian prefect that assassinated Emperor Caracalla, who was the son of Septimius Severus, the first of the Severan dynasty, the last Roman dynasty before what's called the crisis of the 3rd century, that ended up being solved by Diocletian ultimately. But anyway, he had received omens that he would become emperor. And he became worried that Caracalla, the emperor, would interpret some of these things as a threat and have him killed. So he preemptively had the emperor assassinated. When the emperor, I'm trying to remember what he went, he was visiting a temple or something, and he stopped by the road to defecate, and one of the Praetorian guards stabbed him to death and then was actually subsequently killed. But he was killed while pooping. That's Caracalla's destiny. But Caracalla was kind of like Caligula, was kind of unhinged and unbalanced, and probably would have had this guy killed anyway. I'm going to look him up real quick because I don't want to keep talking with suddenly forgetting his name. Caracalla, who was he murdered by? Anyway, the guy who murdered him, the prefect, Macrinus. Or Macrinus. Macrinus is what I always heard him called. So Macrinus had him murdered, and the result of that was that Macrinus got declared emperor. So the omens were true. Macrinus did become emperor. Oh, that's interesting. Roman generals used to go feed chickens before a battle, and if the chickens ate greedily, they viewed it as an omen from the gods. And there was I don't remember who it was. There was a Roman general. The chickens wouldn't eat, and so he killed the chickens. He drowned the chickens in the sea, and then he lost the subsequent battle, thus ignoring the omen from the gods and not paying the gods heed. The Romans viewed religion as like a duty to the state, is that if you weren't participating in the rituals of the state, you were actually putting the state at risk because you could anger the gods. If you anger Jupiter, he might no longer favor Rome, and that could actually destroy Rome. So people took their religion seriously. The religion served some of the people in, whether it was true or not, it served the people. Omens, oracles, whatever you put into your setting in terms of religion needs to make sense to the people and needs to affect them, and also needs to serve them somehow. It needs to be ritualized around something that they do. Okay. You notice that Romans and Greeks, they had gods for all these different domains. There was a god of war. There's a god of harvests. There was a god of this and that. So there's these different domains of the gods affecting their daily lives. And that's an important way to understand how people are going to view religion especially in a kind of setting that's non-modern. And the religion is going to affect the culture. It's going to be pulled into the culture. A religion's a lived experience. It's not just a Bible. And so I think a lot of Protestants have a hard time grasping how religions would look like, because their version of Christianity is so focused on a Bible. They think every religion's got a Bible, and that if they make up a new religion, it has to have a Bible. It's like most religions don't have a Bible. Like, they just don't, right? There's no Bible of the Roman religion. Okay. That doesn't exist. There's no central book that contains both the stories and the theological essence of the religion. That's something that's really only there in a couple of religions. Most folk religions are just traditions. Hardwick says an Aztec type religion being dominant in a setting could make for some interesting stories. Absolutely. That could be one of many ways to view it. I think Robert E. Howard does a pretty good job with it. Different cults, different dedications to different gods with magic involved. That's a good way to look at religion. Every little area has different religions. People are dedicated to different gods. I think if you look at a game inspiration, Elder Scrolls is a really good one because of like the Daedra. There's many gods. They have many different areas, and people interact with them. Like the Daedra sends you on quests to go get different objects for them, and that makes those can make great stories on their own, right? Having the gods get involved. So yeah, that's a good one. Economies. So this is where I've been critical of Brandon Sanderson in the past, because he created a very novel economic system for the Stormlight Archive. And novel, yes. Good and coherent, no. So what kind of money do people use? I'm just going to tell you that in most fantasy settings, you're going to want to just default to metals. If the people are capable of metalworking, chances are the currency ought to be precious metals. It's the simplest way. Why did so many cultures use silver and gold? They were precious. They were easy to identify. They were fungible. They were portable. They held their value. It did all the things that money needed to be. Okay. Fungible means it's in, an ounce of silver is always an ounce of silver. So it's always the same value. Sanderson had this system of jewels that were inside of little glass beads. And, the jewels could hold the light of these crazy magical storms, and that's cool. And you could actually use them as like a power reserve if you were a magician. There's lots of things you could do with crystals in the book. It's very cool. But he went and had that as the economic system. The problem with that is that the crystals are not fungible. Every crystal is a different size, different value, different shape, different capacity. So they're not fungible except via fiat, meaning someone has to say, all the diamond chips are the same value. Talk to any diamond dealer. Diamonds are not the same value. Every diamond is just a different value, right? So they're not fungible. They're not very portable either. Yes, you can have different gems of different values kind of making up your thing. Like this one's worth 100 and this one's worth 10 and this one, the red ruby's worth 20, and the blue rupee is worth 50 or whatever it's going to be, like in Legend of Zelda. But the truth is, those are actually really hard to carry around compared to precious metals. If you have a handful of gems, it takes up a lot of space versus a small sack of coins. Pretty soon you end up just not having to be very portable as a system. It's also not very durable. Having things encased in glass is not very durable. Whereas coins, I could throw them at your head. They could bounce off your armor. They can get trampled by a horse, and they're still a coin. They don't get destroyed by any of that. And they're still just as valuable. Even if you bend the coin in half, break it in half, clip it into pieces, it's always the same amount of metal. So precious metals are going to be your economic system of choice for any fantasy genre that you're working in. Okay. Once you get outside of fantasy and you get to sci-fi, you can do all kinds of crazy things. I did a whole video on like fantasy currencies and why most of them are bad. Another one is like bullets. What's the problem with bullets? Well, you use the bullets. They have an alternate utility, which actually makes them unsuitable as a currency. So it's like, is a bullet a bullet? Well, it depends on the demand for the bullet, right? Like 9mm, more people are going to want that. It's like, well, I got a bunch of like 300 Whisper here. It's like, well, who's going to shoot that? I guess it's a bullet, so it's valuable. We pretend it's worth money, but the value of the bullet isn't that you're going to shoot it at somebody, right? So you probably wouldn't use it as currency because, like, first of all, it's heavy. Ammunition's heavy, guys. If you've never had to like go hiking with ammunition or like go hunting, carrying your ammunition's heavy. Or you've never been in the army and had to carry your own ammo. Like this, just an anecdote. Like my dad, when he was in the army, is like, I never let my role was always semi-auto. You never had full auto on. Why? It was a waste of ammunition, right? If you run out of ammunition in a firefight, you're dead. So you have to actually pace yourself with how you're going to use your ammunition, especially if you're like light infantry, like 11B, 11 Bravo. Ammunition's heavy, so it's not, as far as portability goes, it's heavy. It's lead. It's not fungible. 22 long rifle, not the same as 30-06. Not the same weight, not the same value, not the same amount of materials, not the same usefulness. So it's non-fungible, not very portable, it's too heavy. Has alternate utility, making it not useful, right? Now there's alternate utility for silver. Like we use silver and gold in different things, right? You can make jewelry out of gold, but the alternate utility is pretty limited compared to ammunition or anything else that you want. Now, could you have shells? Yes, you could have shells. As long as people agree that it's a currency, you can pretty much have anything you want. But my general caution is like, if you start thinking really fancy in terms of what people are going to, like primitive people would use shells. Medieval people wouldn't use shells because they're not durable enough and they have better, cooler things to use as currency, like coins. So anyway, yeah, you're probably going to use metals. If you're going into a sci-fi area, you can use whatever you want because right now we don't have we have a currency that exists via fiat. So as long as you have a government that can say that something is a currency, you can make anything a currency. You can make credits a currency. But most governments are not, most governments are not staffed by stupid people. I'm like, I don't know if I can make that statement. Anyway, most governments are not going to pick things as currency that just like destroy, right? They're going to pick something that's durable. Even paper is relatively durable, the way that we treat it. So yeah, you have currency via fiat. Galactic credits. Boom. Do we need to look deeply into how the Central Galactic Bank manages the money supply of the galactic credits? They're like, no, it's just via fiat. It's just this authority called the Galactic Senate says that's how much this is worth. They say that the galactic credits are what people are going to use, therefore they use them. Makes sense. You could also have something like a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, but it's all about what people believe is the currency once you get outside of like, metals and things like that. Pre-modern societies had thousands of years to come up with a good solution to currency, and they all picked precious metals. Anyone that could make the metals picked precious metals. right? Really primitive societies that didn't know anything about metalworking didn't pick precious metals, but they were also probably living in social groups where like money and currency wasn't a significant thing because they weren't trading with other people and they needed a medium of exchange. You know what I mean? So yeah, everyone picked metals. Like I could take the metal, and there's a huge advantage to that. I could get the silver from Babylon and I could travel to Rome and use the silver. The Romans are going to take Babylonian silver just like they would take Roman silver. It's all silver. That's all they care about. It's actually really beautiful that way. It'd be interesting to have a setting where there's no currency, only bartering, and every transaction involves haggling, like in a Middle Eastern bazaar. Yeah, you can totally have that, but it probably wouldn't be a big society, because the thing is, societies tend to come up with solutions to their problems that work. So if they have a problem where there's no currency, they're going to designate something as a currency, or there'll be a clerk that can determine the bartering value of stuff based on something that you get at the bazaar. Off the top of your head, how old are banks and banking in general? It's hard to say. I mean, there's examples of what we would call banking in like ancient Rome. Our modern banking system, I'm not prepared to like give a lecture on like the history of banking at this point. But it developed over a long time. You even had like the Knights Templar getting into banking kind of unintentionally because it was hazardous to carry gold around. So you would get a certificate from the Knights in France, and then you'd go to Jerusalem and you could get the gold from them. So that's like a banking thing, right? It's a deposit slip. So formal deposit slips, they're certainly at least like certainly 1,000 years old at this time. Like central banks, I'm not sure because it developed over time. I've done a lot of reading on it, but I'd have to go back and look at it. England has a very interesting monetary history for the way they used to manage their coinage. What do you think of how religion is handled in Gods of Mars? I don't know. War was so much more interesting back then. Everything's so sterile. They also write their religions how Sanderson writes his magic. Purely materialistic and utilitarian, rigidly defined. Yeah, a pagan, and it's kind of weird because people have this very syncretic view of religion if they're modern. Like they'll be like, Jews and Christians and Muslims worship the same God. It's like they don't worship the Trinity. Only the Christians worship Trinity. The Trinity is something very different from the Muslim concept of Allah. So different, in fact, that I don't think they're worshiping the same God at all. That's a syncretic view. That's a very Roman view. The Romans used to engage in syncretism where they'd be like, okay, welcome tribe that we just conquered. We want to get your gods on your side, so we're going to perform sacrifices for them, and we're going to hail them, and we're going to ask those gods for their blessing and protection. And we're also going to kind of let you know that like your gods are our gods. We're not just like adopting them now. We also have the same gods. Yeah. You call yours, you call yours Thor. We call him Jupiter. You call your god this. We call him Hermes or Pluto. We have these gods and they're the same as your gods. And they make temples, temples to like Isis Venus or something like that, or Isis Juno. I don't remember exactly which ones they would syncretize. So it's a syncretic view. It's viewing that like, okay, everybody's just kind of like, viewing these as the same gods. But they also had a subtle view where gods were maybe not the same god. So there's Jupiter Optimus Maximus. He had a temple in Rome. Jupiter, best and greatest is what that means. Optimus Maximus. Emperors started to add the title Optimus Maximus at different times. Like, I think it was Valerian was like Imperator Maximus, the greatest emperor. Anyway, you might have a statue of Jupiter. You might have an idol to Jupiter in your house or Zeus, and you may not view them as the same Zeus. You may not view them as the same Jupiter. They might be different Jupiters. Your the Zeus for your family could be different than the Zeus in the temple. Could be different gods, and they could be the same, or they could be different manifestations of the same god, and they could be the same god that responds to different names. They had a much more fluid set of beliefs when it came to the gods. The gods could kind of, be lots of different things. Not saying you have to make your fantasy religion like paganism of yore, but it's good to know about how those religions work, and likewise to study, Eastern religions and Eastern folk religions and kind of see how they did things. If you go and study Shinto has a more pagan kind of fluid and inclusive understanding of spirituality versus if you're raised in a Christian or Muslim society that's like, this is the one true religion. All other religions are false. This is the correct one. And you don't do any other religions. Most religions aren't like that. You could be like Buddhist and also do Shinto stuff, and there's no conflict between those, right? And the ancient pagans were like, yeah, why would we not also worship this god and do sacrifices for this god? We want all the gods to like us. We want all the gods to be honored. So we'll honor as many gods as exist. Anyway, yeah, people who have like what I call post-Protestant, not even post-Christian, because Protestantism is one layer abstracted from traditional Christianity, and then when you get above that, you get past that to like atheism. The understanding of like Catholicism and Orthodoxy is like, it's like a foreign world. You have no idea about it. It's just like a mindset that's can be completely foreign to you, because you were from a post-Protestant culture. Protestantism being like post-Catholic, I guess, in some sense. Okay. Onward we go. We've covered geography. How does that make the culture? That's what you want to think about. Religion. How does that affect the culture? Right? You have currency, economics. What crops are you growing? How does that affect the culture? All of those things have to do with it. Now let's talk about the stuff that's really not real. We'll talk about the magic systems, and we'll talk about technology next, because I think that'd be pretty fun to talk about. So now we're going to add some things, like when we're doing a fantasy setting, we're going to add some things that maybe you typically don't have in a fantasy setting, right? You're going to add things you typically don't have in a realistic setting. Things like magic. So magic can happen in a bunch of different ways, right? Magic can be things that you don't understand. Magic can be things that have a system to them, like Brandon Sanderson. Or magic can be things that are derived from the gods, like a sorcery. Okay, so let's look at kind of those three areas. So one area, things that you don't understand. This is what I call like the Fey magic. This is magic that's dangerous, that mortals just don't understand. It's like beyond our ken. It's chaos, and you don't really know what it's going to do or how it's going to affect you, right? So if you meet a fairy, you don't know what the fairy is going to do. You don't know if the fairy is going to be evil. You don't know if it's going to be good. You don't know if it can turn your bread into cheese, right? Anything can happen with that fairy. The fairy is of some sort of magical kin where it can do things that you don't expect. A little further over, you have a character like Gandalf. Gandalf is like an immortal being, and we can talk about like how he exists or what we know he is. But Gandalf has magic. We don't know quite what Gandalf can do, though. Could cast a spell and close a door. Maybe we've seen him do that, but we haven't seen him set up exactly what he can do ahead of time. He's still of that kind of Fey area, right? He's a wizard. And how do we have an obscurity of what his magic can do? The answer is the protagonists are not magical. So this is something that's, I guess, important about Lord of the Rings, is that it's mostly from the view of mortals, right? The hobbits. The hobbits are the ones who dominate the view space of Lord of the Rings. And so because the hobbits are the main viewpoint characters, even though that's not stylistically how it's written, that's more or less the perspective that we're getting there. They don't understand what Gandalf is capable of doing. Gandalf could do lots of different things. Gandalf dies and comes back. Gandalf shoots light, right? So that's magic that's unexplained. And that's best used in a story where the characters don't have control over it. It's something that affects the characters and affects the outcome of the story, but is not something that's predictable and systematized. You get towards like the Sandersonian thing is like, okay, now we want to have characters do magic. Well, it's kind of important in order to maintain a story, a good amount of story tension, that the characters, we establish some sort of limit for what the characters can do. And there's a bunch of different ways to go about this. I'll give you some examples. So like with Brandon Sanderson, with like Allomancy, there's these like 12 metals. I think there's 12 metals. And they do different things when you eat them and you happen to have the Allomancy pattern. So when you eat them and you have the Allomancy, you eat them, you have the Allomancy power, you can do different things with these different metals. And it like consumes them. It like burns them up when you use them. So you have a mana reservoir in the form of how much metal can you swallow. Kind of weird, but it works. And you have certain things that you can do with the metal, like you can propel things forward or jump off the metal or, see in the dark or whatever it's going to be. All the different things that you can do. So you have all the possibilities that a person can do, maybe move faster and like, have faster reactions, hit harder, whatever it's going to be. So in any given conflict, what the character's capable of doing. And then you can create some other characters that can do the opposite of that, right? You have characters that can attack if they want to with the same powers. And how do you counter them? Create some like different kinds of fights that are possible. But the main thing is we're putting boundaries on what we can do. We're turning it into a technology so that the story can have limits on what's going on. In other words, we keep the story tension going. There's danger still for the characters. There's only so many things that they can do, even with their magical powers. You can have kind of looser systems. Like Jack Vance. Jack Vance, you get this idea that the wizards can remember kind of one spell at a time because magic is all inherited from like ancient people or whatever. So that's the limit. You can remember one spell at a time, then you have to stop, memorize another spell. There's RPGs that have this kind of rule set. And in fact, I think Dungeons and Dragons was pretty inspired by Jack Vance in this area. So that puts a limit on what a wizard can do. He can only use that power to a limited degree, like one spell at a time, one per day. And that's kind of what he can do. Eventually you can get into like a more RPG'd area where somebody has like, mana. They have like a mana system that's limiting them. Oh, I only have so much mana. I'm out of mana, and how tight or how loose you want to be with that just depends on what kind of story you want to tell. I tend to keep mine a little looser than like Brandon Sanderson. And, but I don't have like, I try not to give you the impression that characters have like infinite power or something like that, even if they're a magical character, because that's not very fun, right? We want the characters to be in danger and feel like they are out of ideas and have to come up with new ideas, kind of in the nick of time. Now, the last way you can get magic is via sorcery or religious ritual. And this is that the gods grant you magic. So Elric stops. He performs a sorcery and he summons water elementals that do something for him. Okay, so he's not doing the magic. It's really like the gods are giving him power to do magic at some point, right? It's a little bit different approach to to magic, I suppose. But you still have the same kind of limits, which is that you are relying on something that is outside the self and is not unlimited to the self in order to do the magic. We have to hope the gods want to do it. We are requesting something from the gods, maybe a magical artifact, maybe the gods will do something for you. So the sorcery is not from the individual using the magic, but it's gained through some other means and therefore has automatic limits put on it. A lot of fairy tales tend to use a sorcery sort of system. You have a magic lamp. What does the magic lamp have in it? It has a genie. The genie gives you 3 wishes. It's outside the self. Now, it's somewhat predictable, right? Like the genie is not going to turn you into a loaf of bread when it gets angry. So it's not like fey magic, but it's like, okay, it's a sorcery. There's a god that's going to grant you 3 wishes. What are those 3 wishes going to be? You tend to see that a lot with fairy tales, that kind of thing. It's 2 a.m. in Bongland. What is Bongland? It's got to be... Is Bongland like your bedroom? Where you have bongs? I don't know. So anyway, those are those magic systems. Let's look at technology. Technology I'm categorized into 2 areas. So area number 1 is extensions of technology that we have now. So even if it's a fantasy setting, they might have toilets, and the toilets might have plumbing that works the same way our plumbing works, or aqueducts, right? So it's technology that is basically associated with things we already have, maybe with like a variation. You can guess that the Enterprise had toilets on it, okay? The other category would be technology that's basically magic. And so by the way, the first category would be like, okay, you look at the Enterprise. They have a big view monitor on the bridge in like Star Trek The Next Generation. It's a big TV. Okay, that's not a future technology. It's a futurized version of technology we have now. It's a big TV. They're sitting down at their computers using computers. It's a futurized version of a computer, right? So it's technology we have now, just made more badass, like made more advanced, more awesome, you know? Another word for England, bong, in this instance comes from the characteristic noise Ben makes. Is Big Ben the guy who's smoking the pot in your room? I'm in Bongland with Big Ben. Big Ben, your dealer, dude. Anyway, yeah, technology. So, yeah, the big screens in Star Trek, most of it is just our technology, but kind of put into a newer setting, like and it's not even that futuristic, right? It's a computer. Where is Commander Riker? It's like, Commander Riker is in the holodeck. It's like, okay, now we can do that with our phones. They're like, hey, what's 2 + 2? It tells you it's 4, whatever it is. But it's just, even back then, it was a futurized version of technology they had then. Do you know what I mean? So that's one category. Second category is we've made up the technology. It's just a made up technology, right? So think of like we folded space using this special engine. Frank Herbert never goes into like the special engine and how it was designed and what it looks like. It's not a technical manual. The special engine, which I'm forgetting the name of it, it exists to allow you to go to other planets. That's all it exists for. It exists for the purposes of the story. Lumos, 3 a.m. in Viking land. Is it Norway or Sweden or Denmark? Vikings from several areas, right? Yeah. So a warp drive. How does the warp drive work? It mixes, and it's just jargon. So people tend to fill in, they pretend like they're writing hard sci-fi by just writing a bunch of jargon. And I've done it too, right? Oh, this mixes matter and antimatter to produce energy, which we use this huge amount of energy to warp space around the ship and break the time barrier, which actually was something they did in an early Star Trek episode. Like they've never traveled at warp speed before. Early Star Trek is really like such a different beast, even from later Star Trek in the original series. So different. So yeah, like your warp drive, your teleportation device, your Stargate portals. These are magic. These are basically magic. So a sci-fi setting will have things we have now plus magic. It's kind of like a low fantasy, but in the future, right? We have TVs and we have computers and we have easy chairs, and now they're on a spaceship going through space faster than the speed of light because of magic. That's Star Trek. I'm going to shoot my phaser at you. What's a phaser? It's a magic gun, right? It's a gun, but magic. That's a phaser. I have a mind control device. Okay, that's magic. I have a cybernetic arm. That's kind of the first category. It's just a really badass prosthesis, right? I have reptile DNA in me. It's somewhere in the middle, right? I have an artificial heart. Okay, well, that's just a badass version of stuff we have now, right? Like I took it off earlier, but I have an implant hearing aid, right? This connects to a titanium post coming out of my skull. Is it the Holtzman drive? Okay, Holtzman drive. There you go. What do you think of science fiction stories that stick entirely to established science, like Andy Weir's The Martian? They're fine, but they're still using magic in some way, right? They're using a little bit of magic to get to the part of the story, and then there's a bunch of science stuff, right? Like I have time dilation in my story, in my book, Prophet of the Godseed, which I came out with in like 2017, I think. So, Prophet of the Godseed. I have time dilation, right? Time dilation is a real science thing. That's great. That creates some interesting, what kind of interesting story can you tell with that? But you still have to use magic to get someone to the point where they're having time dilation. I'm using magic for them to travel close to the speed of light. Right? If I was using science, then we would already be traveling at the speed of light. Right? We would know how much rocket fuel or what kind of energy to use or how the propulsion would work to accelerate up to the speed of light very quickly. Right? Or the Omni tool for Mass Effect. It's magic. Yeah, Mass Effect has a lot of magic in it. Right? They basically have psychers from Warhammer. So Warhammer 40K is a really interesting setting for this reason. So if you look at Warhammer 40K as like a world building kind of thing. They have to travel through the immaterium, the warp, which is like a place where space doesn't have its constraints. So they travel through the immaterium. This is all magic to go to there. Oh, well, we have our Astartes. They're like immortal, genetically engineered cybernetic superhumans. Magic, right? They're like magical knights, whatever. We have psychers that we sacrifice to the Emperor. Like, there's a magical religion, they have religion in it, right? We have the, what are the Custodes? They're bigger and better. It's basically magic, right? It's a fantasy setting, but just with space stuff. With space aesthetics and power armor aesthetics. That's Warhammer 40K. It's mostly magic. Right? You have the tech priests of Mars. Well, how does the tech work? It's tech. It's technology. Magic. So yeah, I mean, even for something like, like The Martian, you're going to use some kind of like, maybe in the future someone will figure out a technology that can do this. That's kind of magic, right? We're not really explaining how we get to that point, right? Otherwise, we would be there. It's really just saying, like, what if we could go there? If we could get to a singularity, what would happen? If we could accelerate close to the speed of light, what would that be like? And how would we overcome that? That's the way that you construct a good science fiction sort of universe, right? And like, okay, we can't travel the speed of light, but we could travel really fast, but it's still going to take like 50 years to get there. Well, we'll invent stasis. There's no stasis pods. That's magic, right? So we're still using magic to get to the place in the story where the sciencey stuff can have an effect on the story, right? We're like, what if we could really experience time dilation? We still have to, for the purposes of the story, we just have to be creative and come up with some fake technology that allows us to get to that point where that can affect the story and be something fun in the story. I like those things a lot, though. I use them, and I think they're great. Right. A competent government getting involved. The Warhammer 40k Chaos Gods, which are supposedly made up of the collective emotions of the universe. Yeah, it's religion. It's good stuff. Different races. That might be another thing we could talk about is races, aliens, and things like that. In fantasy, races are things like elves and orcs. In sci-fi, it's things like Klingons. Klingons are just space orcs. Space orcs or space Mongolians. Pick one. When they started off as like space Soviets, and then they were kind of space Mongolians, space orcs. Yeah, they're like space orcs. So when you're making up another race, I'm starting to kind of run out of time. I didn't want to stream too long tonight. When you are making up other races, you have two options. Option one is to make them a variant of humanity. That's the more commonly picked option. Option two is to make them truly alien. Option two is way harder to pull off. Option one is what most people go with because it just makes better stories. If you want to have an elvish character, you just make elves a little bit weird. They're weird people. You know, that's kind of what I do. Like orcs are kind of weird people. Vulcans are weird people. You know, Klingons are weird people. Versus there was like an alien in Babylon 5 that couldn't even breathe the same atmosphere as people and couldn't communicate. I reviewed an indie book called... This one, the series was called Parker Interstellar Travels by a guy named Squidlord. But he had an alien that was like very insectoid and didn't communicate with words, but like by moving its many appendages and patterns. How do you communicate with that alien? The alien had a completely different mindset. They were both trying to chase these Trillisk aliens that had trilateral symmetry and therefore thought differently and had different brainwaves and stuff. So you can make an alien really alien and it can be very interesting, but you still need your main characters to be human, and the main interpersonal conflict needs to be more or less between human beings, because the aliens are going to be too alien to understand, right? Most often, if we have an alien that's completely inhuman, it's like the movie Alien. Like the alien is, you know, a monster. So we tend to humanize anything that we're thinking of different races or aliens. The go-to is really to make them a variation of humanity that says something about humanity. Right. Says something about humanity. So like the Klingons are a reflection of a certain view of humanity. This sort of martial, highly warlike, ultra masculine culture, right? So it's a reflection of a part of the human psyche. The Vulcans are super logical and they're concerned with logic. So they're the Stoics of the Star Trek world. The Romulans are more like they're both basically the same alien race, but the Romulans are emotional, so they're more, I don't know what would be a good competing philosophy to Stoicism. I don't know. Someone in the chat will come up with a good competing philosophy. You know, you have those kind of things. So they're all reflections of people, and that tends to be what most people do. Not Machiavellian. I mean, they can be. Machiavellianism is a different thing. I'm just thinking of like, you know, they're like cynics or something. You know, they're just a different. They're more materialistic. The Romulans are not materialistic. They're more emotional, right? What part of The Martian could be considered magic? I have to look up the plot. But generally, I was saying like getting there. Maybe I'm thinking of another one. I'm thinking of Interstellar. I'm thinking of Interstellar. Right. But actually getting to getting to Mars is magic. Like we can't get people to Mars yet. on it, right? We can't really, right? We could eventually. So it's probably in that first category of like, it's our current technology just kind of like going forward. I was thinking of Interstellar. Sorry, I was thinking of the movie Interstellar with Matthew McConaughey, not The Martian. That's my bad. Yeah. If I think about it, I'll give you a sci-fi movie that actually does have like one kind of magic element in it. It's one called Sunshine. I'm trying to remember when it came out, like a long time ago now. But the thing was like, oh, we're going to use fissile material to make the sun brighter again. Okay, that doesn't work that way. But it's a plot device that exists to make the characters do the things that the movie needs them to do. If that makes sense. So yeah, I mean, I think stuff like Martian is great. That's just kind of looking a little bit forward, I guess. But you're still like, you're still using technology that doesn't exist yet. But you haven't like come up with like, oh, well, we're using a special drive that makes us teleport or something. That's magic. So I guess that's the point I'm getting at, right? So I'm thinking of like Interstellar, which he gets trapped in like a singularity or something. So to get there, right, you have to have some sort of thing that we don't have to get there. Like it's kind of beyond us. I mean, there's challenges with Mars. Maybe we'll overcome them, maybe not. I don't know. But, a Klingon society is a bit like the Bushido code. Yeah, there's elements of that too. It's like an honor thing, an honor code, right? I'll admit my elves are basically feral tree huggers with some animalistic features. That's kind of us, right? It's the savage, fey version of us. And that's fine. That's actually not bad because we want to be able to relate it to and understand them. It's weird to think that we haven't been to the moon in decades for all our technological progress. Well, there was a few things with the moon that other people have pointed out. Is there a reason to go there? It's very expensive. So after you go there, you have to have a reason to keep going there. So after the end of the Apollo mission, it's like you could keep spending lots and lots of money burning up jet fuel to go there, or, the rocket fuel to go there. But what are you going to do there? Just be there? I mean, are there minerals there we need to mine? So that's the big one, is like there's not, like, going to the moon doesn't do anything. It doesn't get us towards another step on its own. Maybe it could at some point, but like right now it doesn't. I like the idea that maybe a bunch of aliens are humans, either kidnapped from ancient Earth to seed other planets or descended from an ancient spacefaring Earth society. Yeah, I like that idea too. That's there's some of that in Star Trek. They also had this thing where like all of the races that you're used to in Star Trek were like created by some other mother race. Kind of weird. And nobody liked that. Yeah, it makes sense why they're all biologically compatible with each other. They're descended from the same race. But like, yeah, Romulans and Vulcans are the same race, basically. But it's Vulcan culture that makes them logical, not Vulcan physiology. It's kind of important to think about. Anyway, I'm kind of running out of time for tonight. I've got about 10 more minutes. I think I'm going to skip the live write and do that on another stream, because I'm actually really tired. I was up till like 6 a.m. or something. My daughter couldn't sleep. So I may call this one a little bit. It's not super early. I started kind of late. But I may call this one after an hour and a half instead of 2 hours. The whole lunar module dropping down, reblasting off, then reconnecting mid-orbit part of the moon mission seems like it was an engineering nightmare. I mean, it was probably a physics and timing nightmare, too, when you think about it. Right? But they did a bunch of things prior to that to prove that they could do it, like with the Gemini program. Where it's like, can we get into space and have two spaceships hook up? Because like space is big. How do we get two objects to get close enough to each other to link up? Can we even do that? And if you can do that, then okay, then we could have one spaceship go to the moon and come back. And if it's timed correctly, they could get close enough to link back up again and head back to Earth, right? It's kind of interesting thing. It is really interesting to think about, though. It probably is a lot of time. And they did it, keep in mind that like they did all that stuff with like what we would consider pocket calculators now, right? They didn't have supercomputers to calculate all those trajectories. They had to do a lot of it by hand. The computers were hand-wired computers, and all the electronics were like hand-wired. They didn't have supercomputers to manage all the systems. It's wild to think about that. Just with like the right physics, you could do the moon missions. You just knew physics and had smart guys able to do all the calculations to a good enough degree that you could do the moon missions. You didn't need super advanced computers. What are some world building tropes you're not keen on? I'm not a fan of cosmopolitanism in my fantasy villages. I'm not sure what cosmopolitanism means in this context. But I'm not a fan of characters with modern sensibilities existing in pre-modern societies. Whenever I see that, it's very cringy. And I see it, I'll tell you where I see it the most. I see it with translations of Japanese media. Quote, localizations. They start inserting American cultural tropes into things that they don't belong in. Like a medieval fantasy setting will have what it basically amounts to modern tropes. It just breaks the immersion for me. I don't like that. Those people wouldn't say those things. Yes, you're right. You're a modern writer writing for a modern audience. So that breaks the idea that you're looking at something it breaks the fantasy, and then it becomes the writer talking to you. Not a fan of that, personally. That's what I meant as well. Yeah, I don't like that. That's the thing that breaks immersion for me. Whether it's a game or a movie, it just takes me completely out of it. Now, there's times where I kind of let it go. Like there's a part in The Two Towers, the Peter Jackson movie, where like one orc chops off another's head and says, "Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys." Orcs didn't have menus. What's a menu? Right? Maybe the hobbits might know what a menu is. Oh, thank you for the super chat. Yes, modern to pre-modern doesn't look right. Yeah. Yeah, putting the modern and the pre-modern doesn't quite work right. Anachronism doesn't bug me too much for like small things. Like if somebody has matches, hobbits have matches. Cool. To me that's fine, right? It doesn't break things. What would break things is if it's like hobbits have like, gas stoves or something. They have things that like no one would have had in that kind of setting. It doesn't make sense, like gunpowder or something like that. But anachronisms can really break people out of things. It really can. We're talking about anachronistic speech, but there's other kinds of anachronisms that I think can really break people out of a setting and ruin the immersion, ruin the suspension of disbelief, if you will. Technology that shouldn't be there, customs that shouldn't be there, attire or clothes that they wouldn't wear, things like that. Like, the hobbits have buttons on their clothes. It's like medieval people didn't usually wear buttons on their clothes. Hobbits had fireworks. Do those require gunpowder? They probably do. Well, the hobbits didn't have them, but Gandalf did. And Gandalf is like a lowish angel, right? So they didn't really have fireworks, but the fireworks were like a thing that they knew of and appreciated, right? Technically, fireworks existed in the medieval period too, though. A lot of people have to remember that, like, cannons were being fielded, I think, in the 13th century. Either the 13th or the 14th century, we started to have cannons. So it took a long time for like the technology to fully utilize gunpowder, but gunpowder was around really in the high medieval. We had gunpowder already. Weird to think about, because if you don't think about medieval battles, you think of like knights in shining armor, and it's like now by the 15th century, like gunpowder was everywhere, right? But there was cannons in the 14th century, probably in the 13th century. I have to look it up again, but yeah, that kind of stuff is there. And then, you know, the ancients had Greek fire. They had explosives. They had like really high destructive stuff. You know, Greek fire, I think, was like something that people lost the recipe to it, or they lost the secret to it for like 1,000 years. Didn't know how to do Greek fire again. But it's called Greek fire, which is like tar that burns in a certain way. To be fair, in early drafts, Melkor built mech dragons to storm Gondolin. I like that. That's cool. That would be very cool. But Melkor being a god this is another thing with Tolkien, right? He'll reference that the goblins have various machines and engines and stuff. We don't really see them, but he even says like many of the bad things from today might have been invented by goblins or by orcs. So they were like intelligent. They were very intelligent, but they put that to bad use in doing things that were against nature, things like that. So there's a lot of little anachronisms that are in Middle Earth. You end up kind of letting them go because they're not in your face and they're not impacting the story a whole lot. Yeah, Saruman built explosives too. But again, these are guys that are like, they're gods. You know, they understand how, you know, somebody who comes in and understands physics. The people around him don't understand that stuff at all. So, yeah, Saruman could build explosives, but, you know, there's also the Atlantean myth. I don't want to get too deep into Middle Earth stuff, but like the Numenorean people, by the time you read Lord of the Rings, have fallen, and they've fallen in terms of culture, in terms of genetics, in terms of technology. They had seeing stones that they could magically use to look around with, right? They probably had explosives. They probably had a lot of really good technology before the sinking of Numenor. You know, they were like Atlantis. That's what Numenor was supposed to be. So, yeah, Last Alliance of Men and Elves. Who knows what they were using to fight Sauron then? We don't have like a clear description of exactly what happened or like what technology they had. It's not important. It's all backstory. It's all there to kind of set up the Third Age. When you're walking through the Third Age, you're walking through a world that has already fallen into ruins and fallen away from what it was. You're walking through the past. You're walking through Moria and all the crazy technology they may have had and what kind of amazing tooling they had to make Moria. All those sorts of things. Yeah. It's really an anachronism. It's a fictional age. It's not really set in the Middle Ages. Yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, it feels like Middle Ages, right? People have swords and armor. That's a good point. But it's fiction. So it's not really anachronism. It'd be more like, well, if this was present, why aren't they not using it? Like, why are they still using mail if they have shotguns, if they can make shotguns? Well, they can't make shotguns, right? So it doesn't affect the story in a negative way, I guess is my big point. It's like having stuff like, oh, there's gunpowder technically exists, and matches or buttons, like things that outside there, we get the sense that it's like a more medieval fantasy world. You know, you probably wouldn't have those things, but it is right. You know, Hardwick's right. It's a fictional age. It's like the Hyborian age. I mean, Robert E. Howard to do this. Conan's a pirate, and Conan's fighting snake cults, and Conan, you know, like, did they have pirate ships in the Hyborian Age? Well, for the purposes of the story, they did. Why not? They have some pirate ships. It's about the story being fun and having a good conflict and a good way towards resolution, I think. So, anyway. All right. It's 8:30. I'm about ready to call it here. Thanks so much, guys, for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm going to skip the live write today because I am just tired, and also my camera's starting to glitch for some reason. So sorry about that. I will be back about the same time next week, 6:30. I got started a little bit late today, but should be okay. And I'll do another live write some point in this week to continue working on the book so that is having progress made towards it. And we'll do the book live. We're doing everything live. Yeah. Due to the weather, it was also a little hard to be productive with everything else going on. We had a hard freeze here. So take it easy, guys. Have a great one, and I will see you all next time.